Hello everyone and welcome to History of Literary Criticism series. This is session 3 in which we're going to talk about Horace, who lived in 65 to 8 BC in Rome. Here's a picture of Mr. Horace, and please keep this name in mind because he is one of the most important and most influential figures in the history of literary criticism. As I said before, Horace was a Roman, and he is said to be the most influential and quoted critic during Renaissance and Neoclassical period. He wrote a letter to a friend, and today we know this letter by the title of The Art of Poetry, which is a translation of the original name or original title, which is Ars Poetica. But before going any further, let me put you in the context and give you some historical facts and information about Horace and his work. At the time that Horace lived, Alexander the Great was already gone and Greece was already in decline. There were no thinkers like Plato and Aristotle anymore. If you remember, in our previous sessions, we talked about Plato and Aristotle, and we introduced them as the, probably most famous and best thinkers and philosopher of their own time. But at this time, because of this decline in Greek civilization, we don't see that many people like Plato and Aristotle anymore. During this time, Augustus was in power in Rome, and Augustus was a friend of Horace, which actually gives him this kind of majestic status in Rome at the time. And here is actually just what I said about Horace, who wrote a letter to his friend Piso, and that letter came to be the Bible of some poets in the during the Neoclassical period by the title of Ars Poetica, or the Art of Poetry. It's a kind of handbook of a stable and aristocratic society, as Vernon Hall mentions that in his book. Well, as I mentioned before, Horace tries to set some rules and introduce some features of good poetry. Let's take a look at a list of the features that I have populated here on my slides. The first one, it's the poetry of good sense, which means good poetry is a poetry in which sound judgment, which is often instinctive or unlearned, is the focus and is highly valued. Okay, so sound judgment. That's actually what he calls the poetry of good sense. Good poetry stands the test of time. So, for example, if you want to just identify good poetry, you may probably go to works written by Greek writers, works that were actually the products of a certain period of Greek civilization, and then you will see that they have already stood the test of time, which means they have not faded away or vanished just, by the passage of time. So they are good poetry or good literature. Okay? Next one is that they are inspired, or they should be inspired, by Greek literary masterpieces. So, in a sense, originality is not something that Horace values here, okay? Because every time that he speaks about good poetry, he means something which has followed the steps of Greek writers and Greek poets. Good poetry for Horace avoids going to extreme and values simplicity, which means If you get too emotional as a poet, you are not actually the favorite uh, type of his favorite type of poet. Or if you write in a way which is very complicated, complex, and probably difficult to understand, you're not again one of his favorite types. Actually, he values simplicity and warns us, advises us against going to extreme while writing. For him, good poetry chooses the middle path between terseness and obscurity, grandeur and bombast. Well, terseness means writing in a very short way, and also probably you know the meaning of obscurity and grandeur, but for bombast, if you write in a way that is too pretentious, that is actually writing in that way. We call it bombast, okay? So a good poet, according to Horace, chooses the middle path between terseness and obscurity, grandeur and bombast. A good poet for Horace includes proper words, moderate vocabulary, and lucid arrangement. And a good poet for Horace does not favor or does not coin, let's say, a lot of new words, okay? So coinage is less frequent in good poetry. That's actually what Horace believes in. And he believes that even if you want to coin a word, it has to be drawn from Greek sources. Again, we see how much he appreciated the works and the manners of Greek poets. Okay, now let's see how different Horace is from people like Plato and Aristotle. They come from two different civilizations. Plato and Aristotle come from Greek civilization. Horace is a Roman, comes from Rome or Roman civilization, right? So let's see in what ways they are different and in what ways they are similar. The first thing that is very important for us to know is their ideas regarding imitation. Plato and Aristotle understood imitation as imitation of nature. Please do not confuse nature here with just external nature. We're not talking about flowers or mountains or rivers and things like that. This nature means human nature, okay? It might include that external nature as well, but this is not the focus of what Plato and Aristotle were discussing, okay? So imitation for Plato and Aristotle is the imitation of nature, okay? You remember how they believed in this ideal world, and then we already discussed that Plato believed that poets are lawyers because they are two steps removed from the reality or ideality of that world, and Aristotle actually said something opposite to his master, but still believed that there is a world of ideals. Okay? But here, Horace believes in imitation of Greek writers. Okay? So, in a sense, he fully deviates from the concept of imitation as put forward by Plato and Aristotle. While Plato and Aristotle believed in imitation of nature, he believes in imitation of Greek writers because, again, he believed that Greek writers actually set the highest standards for writing poetry and creating a literary work. Also, in terms of creativity, he didn't appreciate creativity that much. He believed that a good poet, instead of relying too much on creativity, has to imitate past writers. Again, because past writers and past works have stood the test of time. Remember, we already discussed that maybe 5 minutes ago, right? So for Horace, Homer is the highest, let's say, figure in epic poetry. What Homer writes as epic poetry sets the highest standard for epic poetry in all times. So if you want to write a poem, let's say an epic poem, instead of just relying on your own creativity, look at Homer and then just imitate Homer, copy Homer in a sense. The next one that he emphasizes here is etiquette and decorum. Well, for him, decorum matters a lot. By etiquette and decorum, he means propriety and good taste in conduct or appearance. Okay? Decorum for him is just, a certain type of arrangement. Okay? So fitness, let's say. This kind of fitness, this kind of orderliness or propriety matter a lot for Horace here. The next thing is just sticking to tradition and being consistent in poetic invention. Okay? Which means, again, you have to look back at Greek civilization, Greek literature, and then if you want to write poetry, if you want to create a literary work, you need to be consistent in terms of using the characters and, let's say, characterizing whatever you learn from Greek literature. Okay? Inconsistency is not something to be valued for Horace. Another important point which we need to mention here is using old themes. Again, if you remember, Horace was against, originality and reliance on your own creativity to produce literature, right? He tells us that use old themes because old themes always result in satisfaction. And actually, they, again, the poets have demonstrated that in Greek literature, right? So old themes end in satisfaction. And that's why he puts emphasis on using old themes, not new ones. But no problem if you want to see old things in a new way. So in a sense, keep the old wine, just change the bottle. That's his philosophy here. Okay? Keep the old wine, just change the bottle. Pour the old wine in a new bottle. That is actually what he mentions here and what he advises us to do as poets. Another important thing is not going to extreme and aiming your sights low. This is actually a very interesting saying here that you should not write poetry in a way that it's as if mountain labored and brought forth a mouth. Okay? So this mouth has to be changed because that is mouse, not mouth. Sorry for that. So these are some of the most important, let's say, points of Ars Poetica or the art of poetry, as a kind of standard list for all the future poets. Okay? Now, let's go to the other point which is important for him. Horace believed that if you're writing epic, it has to begin from the middle. And his term, the term that he uses for this is just in medias res, which means right in the middle. Why? The reason is that Homer has done that. So again, we see here that Homer is very important for him because he is just the standard or the model that has stood the test of time. Okay? See how these ideas just run through other ideas that he puts forward regarding the form of the poetry and regarding the way that poets have to, organize their content. He believes that a good poet should use universal characters. By this, he means that the spectator should know immediately what to expect, which means nothing should be too surprising for the beholders of a play, for example, or the spectator or the reader of a poem, right? So, something else which is important here is just, when we say universal characters, we should keep in mind that universal characters are always the same thing, behave in the same way, and act in the same way. For example, children should act like children, and the elderly like the elderly. For example, we know that children are always capricious, right? Change very quickly. Or we know that the old people do not like new things most of the time, right? That is actually what he means by universality of the characters. Or a king should act and talk like a king. And ironically, it is Shakespeare who violates this rule in Henry IV, and that's actually one of the cases that we see that this rule is violated. Okay, so he believes that universal characters populate good poetry. And again, remember that when we say poetry, we're all referring to all forms of literature, plays, poems, everything. Unlike Aristotle, Horace advises against showing violence on a stage. Aristotle does not have any problem or any issue with showing violence on this stage because if you remember, I already told you that Aristotle was not trying to set rules for literature or poetry. Aristotle was just describing poetry as it was at his own time. But Horace has an idea here, has a point. Do not show violence on the stage because it's not a very good thing to perform and to put on the stage. Instead, report it. Let's, for example, if you are dealing with a play, for example, if you're writing a play, let one messenger come to the stage and then report a violent scene. Do not show it under the nose of the beholder or those people who are watching the play. Unlike Aristotle, Horace advocates 5 acts for plays. All plays, no matter what kind of plays they are. Again, remember, Aristotle was not going to set rules for poetry, but Horace is. Okay? Horace is just trying to set rules for poetry because he is so preoccupied with standards and appropriate criteria for all literary practitioners. Another important thing that Horace believed in is that labor, which means practice, which means working and working and working, is superior to and more important than inspiration. So for him, a poet is the product of a lot of labor and practice and hard work, not just talent, okay? Not just this God-given gift, okay? So labor, practice, working, that is actually something that we have to appreciate in a poet, not just the genius or the talent that a poet probably is born with. Again, I remember I talked about this maybe 15 minutes ago, that the essence of poetry is sound judgment or sapere. which means wisdom combined with learning. So, in a sense, Horace is just putting emphasis on this rational power of human being, reasoning that we just endowed with, reasoning that we are equipped with. Okay? So, sound judgment. Also, he believes that the poem should be delightful and useful, which means he believed as teaching as the prime function of literature. But this teaching has to come with pleasure. So, in a sense, he believed in something which is very famous, a sugar-coated pill. So, poetry for Horace means sugar-coated pill, which means, yeah, look at this picture here. This is just, the way that he thought about poetry. It has to teach, but it has to teach with pleasure. So, sugar-coated pill. So don't forget about the standards that he's setting forward here, that we need to write a poetry which is delightful, but prior to that, it has to include something. It has to contain something which is instructive, something that teaches us something about life. So again, hard work is superior to genius, and moderation is superior to imagination. Okay, so imagination. Why do you think he doesn't favor imagination? Because imagination is something which most of the time goes to extreme. Imagination is something that wants to just, uh, unbound itself from all the chains and shackles of rational power of humans. Okay? Imagination is the thing that goes us to extreme. And of course, we know that a lot of inventions and a lot of progress in human life come from imagination. But this is something that Horace didn't believe in as the source of poetry or as the source of fine poetry as he understood it. For Horace, imagination is not actually the source of good poetry. Why? Because we said before, he believed in sound judgment. He believed in reasoning. He believed in wisdom plus learning. He believed in this kind of ideas regarding the essence of poetry, okay? So hard work is superior to genius, and moderation is superior to imagination. Okay, I just try to keep it short and easy to understand. There are lots of texts that if you are interested, you can just read and contemplate the ideas that he puts forward in Ars Poetica or the Art of Poetry. But I think for beginners, those people who are just new to the world of literary criticism, this is just a very brief overview of the most important ideas of Horace that he has put forward in his book, Ars Poetica, or the Art of Poetry. Now, here I have a question for you. Think about this question and write your answers in the comment section below the video. With all that you learned today, who do you think appreciates Horace more, a romantic poet or a new classical poet, and discuss why. And in the meantime, if you have any question, you can just put your questions in comment section, and I will try to find the time and answer your questions. Thank you very much for listening, and have a great day. Until the next session.